Hello, my name is Scott Lloyd, and I'm going to discuss adaptive video game music and how it impacts player satisfaction. The first thing that comes to your mind is probably, well, what is adaptive video game music? I'm glad you asked. I'm about to tell you. Adaptive music in video games allows for the player to have conscious and unconscious control over what can be heard within the game's soundtrack at any given moment. This is also dependent on what kind of system the developers have in place in the game's engine, but more specificity on that topic will be touched on in just a bit. Adaptive music in video games allows for a player to craft their own unique experience to tell a friend about, or to recall a memory, for example, saying, "Oh, I remember when the song switched this part during the boss fight. That was amazing!" Adaptive audio is one of the most essential parts that make video games a unique medium in comparison to other forms of entertainment. As games have gained more popularity, the medium has continually evolved how the application of adaptive music is used within the context of gameplay. Being a relatively new form of entertainment, video games have a history that must be discussed in terms of evolution of adaptive music and how each game has continued to build off of games that have come before them. Each console generation, developers have found a new way to innovate, furthering the progress of how seamless adaptive music is today in games such as Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, and Journey. Excuse me. These three games will serve as examples that highlight why adaptive music is important in video games as far as immersion and player satisfaction is concerned. This also poses the question, how does adaptive music in video games impact player satisfaction? Before answering that question outright, I would like to take a brief detour into the history of adaptive music, as I feel it is important to understand how adaptive music came to be and how far it has come in order to fully answer that question. Even though I'm fully aware it is a bit of a cliche to start here in terms of this subject, Pong is one of the earliest and most famous examples of adaptive audio in video games. The response of the ball hitting each player's paddle was revolutionary for its time, so much so that the industry started to grow with companies developing similar games around the same time as Pong, practically copying the same concept of the game. A few years later, Space Invaders was the next push for adaptive music. The basic premise of the game, for those who don't know, is to stop aliens that are slowly moving from the top of the screen from being able to reach the bottom of the screen. The player must shoot down each alien or else they will lose. As the aliens drew closer to the player, the four-tone looped melody that would play would speed up. This was meant to provoke a sense of panic in the player to play better to avoid losing. Writing music for games in this archaic period of game development was very slow because sound designers would have to combine transistors, condensers, and resistance. And sometimes, music and sound were even created directly into the central processing unit port, or CPU port for short, by writing ones and zeros. So the composer would have to write something like 10001 by hand, essentially being fluent in binary. In 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan and in 1985 released its North American counterpart, the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short. Please just call it the NES. Composer Yukio Kaneoka invented a new sound chip specifically designed for the NES that used a custom 5-channel programmable sound generator, or PSG for short. This custom PSG chip had 2 pulse wave channels that had a range of 8 octaves, 4 options to set timbre, and a noise channel capable of creating white noise, which was useful for transition noises, crescendos, and percussion. The final channel operated as a sampler, which was called a delta modulation channel, otherwise shortened as DMC. The DMC was typically used for speech or sound effects. Beating Nintendo's SNES and Super Famicom to the punch for the 16-bit era, Sega released the Mega Drive and Genesis in 1988 and 1989, respectively. These consoles were capable of more musical and overall sound possibilities with their frequency modulation chips, FM chips for short. Most FM chips had around 6 oscillators for each sound, which were able to simulate more realistic sounding instruments than any previous sound chip on the market. FM chips offered a wider range of timbres and sounds than what was formerly possible with earlier sound chips. Sony's first effort at a 32-bit home console released in 1994. It was called the PlayStation. The console played solely CD-ROM games as CDs were on the rise in the industry due to their immense upgrade in memory and sound fidelity in comparison to cartridges. One game that showed the leap in audio fidelity was Squaresoft's 1997 release, Final Fantasy VII. The JRPG that took over the world, Final Fantasy VII, used MIDI from the onboard synth chip and allowed for very dynamic music with smooth transitions between tracks. The PlayStation 2, released in 2000, offered support for multi-channel surround sound, which includes a sound processing unit able to produce 16-bit audio with a maximum sample rate of 48 kHz, which is better than CD audio quality. The PS2 also boasts an additional 48 MIDI channels with the caveat that sound still had to be compressed in order to save space on the disc. The PlayStation 3, released in 2006, boasts even more channels than the PlayStation 2, 512 channels to be specific. The channels were able to apply different layers of audio as well as DSP filters in real time. Once again, though, audio still fights for shared system memory and CPU processing due to system priorities. Therefore, the audio must be compressed just like the previous console generations. Sony released the PlayStation 4 in 2013, thus entering the 8th home console generation. During the PlayStation 4's lifetime, two of the greatest examples of adaptive music done very well were released, those being Devil May Cry 5 and Final Fantasy VII Remake. They would later get re-released on the PlayStation 5 as the definitive versions of each respective game. Those definitive versions are the versions I used for my research. In holiday season of 2020, Sony released their newest model in PlayStation lineup, the PlayStation 5. The PS5 is the current generation of gaming with a library that includes games that continue to push the envelope for adaptive music such as Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, Kena Bridge of Spirits, Spider-Man Miles Morales, and many more titles. In Spider-Man Miles Morales, if the player enters free fall from a very tall building, the only thing that can be heard is the wind whizzing past Spider-Man until the player decides they want to use their web shooters, in which then heroic music strikes into action as the player swings from building to building all throughout New York. It is very cool and invigorating. The current generation shows how far developers have come in terms of consistent innovation in regard to the application of adaptive video game music. Now it's time to discuss and understand the techniques used in 6 specific games. Composing music for video games is an entirely different process in comparison to film and other forms of media. Film is a linear experience, meaning that a person's experience will largely be the same as everyone else's. Music in film is generally planned with the director and composer in the same room, watching back an edited clip from the movie while the composer and director discuss what's the best approach for scoring the section of the movie. Video games have a very different process going into composing for them, and will vary even more based on genres. In order to keep the scope of my research from becoming obtuse, I wanted to set emphasis on 3 games, with 2 games per genre, and each genre I wanted to highlight one game to highlight how adaptive music was made in older generations, and one game to highlight how adaptive music is made for relatively current generation games, to show how much adaptive music has improved across all genres. Those 3 genres are adventure, hack and slash, and role-playing games, RPGs for short. For adventure, I wanted to talk about Monkey Island 2 and Journey. For hack and slash, I wanted to set emphasis on Devil May Cry and Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. For role-playing games, I wanted to analyze Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. Between these 6 different games, 4 different types of adaptive systems are utilized. I'll start by talking about the adventure games first, starting with Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge. Monkey Island 2 was released back in 1991 for the Mac OS and effectively pushed the envelope for adaptive music. As the player maneuvers the character from screen to screen, interacting with objects that push the narrative forward, layers of music will phase in to help give the player a sense of direction. The music gives feedback to the player that they're on the right track. The composer Peter McConnell used an interactive music streaming engine called iMuse, which allowed for a technique for creating adaptive music called vertical layering. Vertical layering is a system that is commonly used by game developers in the industry. In essence, the music is not captured in a single audio recording. Each layer of musical sound features unique content. Each of the layers represent a certain percentage of the entire musical composition. For more context with Monkey Island 2 as a hypothetical example, say the objective is to talk to the bartender in the bar. The player promptly goes to interact with the bartender, but the bartender asks the player to go retrieve something for him before being able to divulge information to move the narrative forward. Essentially a fetch quest. The player goes off to find said item and picks it up. When the player picks up the item, more percussion is added to the soundtrack that is currently playing, giving feedback to the player that they had found the right item to push forward the narrative. That's essentially how vertical layering works, adding more instrumentation on top of what is already playing based on the player's interactions within the virtual space. Normally in a game from the same era as Monkey Island, the music has very rigid transitions from song to song. Don't worry, we're going to talk about that pretty soon. However, the composers for Monkey Island 2 thought to employ vertical layering instead. They, being the composers, found that the music being more intelligent and responsive to a player's input was better and was made possible through the use of iMuse. iMuse is able to recognize which measure and beat the music is on during any situation in the game and appropriately play a musical fill to bridge a transition to a separate piece, as well as add and remove instrumentation from the mix and depending on the player's interactions with the world. The more modern example of an adventure game comes with Journey, an indie game that sets emphasis on the music guiding the player and encouraging them to progress further throughout the world. Journey's soundtrack is unique in the fact that it was developed alongside the game as opposed to in post-production like most soundtracks. This is because every area in the game is mapped musically, meaning whatever path the player decides to venture down, they will experience an evolving soundtrack based solely on where they are in the level. The soundtrack is hard-coded into the game as opposed to using any type of proprietary system such as iMuse. For this to be easier to understand, I'll provide an example. The player is at the bottom of a massive temple and needs to get to the top. As the player ascends farther up in the temple, more strings and harmonies are slowly added. However, the player can decide they want to jump all the way back to the bottom of the temple, and the music will respond to the player's actions by stripping away everything from the mix that was earned on the way back up, back to the skeletal composition they started with at the bottom of the temple. Now, let's move on to the hack and slash genre with the game Devil May Cry. In 2001, a new subgenre was born with the conception of Capcom's hack and slash hit Devil May Cry. The hack and slash genre is a subgenre of action games where the combat system is deep and rewarding to learn due to the sheer amount of combos the player can perform through practice and dedication. The approach to this game's soundtrack is simplistic. The music loops until a certain objective is met and then rigidly transitions into another track. This was still common for the era of games that Devil May Cry came out in. After all, Devil May Cry was the first of its genre, so you can't be too hard on it. If the player is finding their way through the castle that the game takes place in, then the game's non-combat music will begin to play until the player is met with an enemy, in which case the music would abruptly change to combat music. Devil May Cry didn't set much emphasis on the music like its later sequels would. It wasn't until Devil May Cry 5 that the development team decided to build a music system around how well the player is performing within the game, as well as how, quote-unquote, stylish they are when performing combos. The composers of the battle tracks made sure that the choruses of their songs were empowering and catchy so that the player would actually feel rewarded when they play well within the game. This is called the rank system. How the rank system works, essentially, is when a player uses a variety of attacks within a combat scenario, their style rank will begin to increase. The range of style ranks are D, C, B, A, S, SS, and SSS. I won't say the names of the ranks, just so that we stay in an appropriate manner. With this in mind, when a combat scenario begins, the intro, the battle theme for the character that you're playing as, whether it be Nero, Dante, V, or Virgil, will be looped until the player or enemy makes the first strike. Then the verse of the character's battle theme will begin. The verse chosen to be played at this moment will be random in order to keep each combat scenario fresh. The verse will continue to loop until the player reaches an A-style rank, in which the pre-chorus begins, and if the player is skilled enough to reach an S-style rank, then the chorus of the character's battle theme will begin and continue to play all the way up to triple S-style rank. Each transition is smooth, with a musical fill to bridge each part together to feel as natural as possible. If the player isn't consistent with changing up their attacks in a combat scenario, then the style rank will decrease and the music will react in real time to this. This means if the player has an S style rank and drops to a B rank because they got hit, then the music will drop out of the chorus and transition immediately back to the verse until the player builds up their style rank once again. Now onto the final genre to cover, role-playing games. Players who want to experience a world rich with lore and quests find solace in the genre of role-playing games. RPGs as a genre is a very wide blanket term. Typically, a RPG is a very sizable game clocking in at around 40 to 60 hours on average for completion on the main quest line with multiple branching side quests to help immerse the player even more in a world lovingly created by the developers. Final Fantasy is no stranger to this genre. The first game saved Squaresoft, the development team, from going bankrupt due to their newfound success in the genre. It wasn't until Final Fantasy VII where Squaresoft created one of the most iconic and influential JRPGs of all time. Final Fantasy VII used MIDI, which allowed for more dynamic music than what was on the market at the time of its release. It also freed up space on the CPU in order to render the revolutionary 3D graphics in the game. Well, revolutionary at its time, of course, as you can see. Much like Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy VII's music system rigidly switches between overworld music and battle music depending on what is happening in the game. In a role-playing game, especially from the 90s, the player would have control of the character in a 3D space that is called the overworld, which is essentially the map that allows the player to travel from point A to point B. In between point A and point B, the player can be met with what's called a random encounter in which the player can decide to fight or flee from battle. At this point, the music would quickly switch from the overworld music to the battle music. This is quite an old approach to adaptive music in video games. However, in 2020's remake of the same game, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Square Enix opted for a more adaptive approach that is much more akin to modern action games since Final Fantasy VII Remake is, after all, an action role-playing game. The approach here is very similar to how vertical layering works. However, as opposed to phasing in and out instrumentation, the arrangement of the track will change entirely. Since this game's story is really important to people, I'm going to use examples from the very beginning of the game in an effort to avoid spoiling someone's experience in case someone who is watching this hasn't had the chance to play it yet. To provide an in-game example of how the system works, two of the main cast, Cloud and Barrett, are infiltrating a reactor in one segment of the game, and what can be heard is the track Mako Reactor 1, while the player is venturing around the environment until, suddenly, the characters are met with a couple of enemies that need to be taken down. In that moment, the music will change to the battle edit of Mako Reactor 1. No matter what measure or beat, it will be the same song but with more upbeat energy. The composers like to think of this method as a professional DJ player is switching the music on the fly with seamless transitions. With this in mind, that means that each piece has multiple different arrangements to accommodate this newer approach to how the music works. Now on to satisfaction from adaptive music to answer the question from, say, 20 minutes ago. How does adaptive music impact player satisfaction? Well, when designing games, the player should be at the center of the developer's mind since that is the target audience. Everything, including adaptive music, should be consistent and cohesive so that the player's experience and immersion aren't compromised. There are many steps to consider when creating music, especially adaptive music, for video games. Sound designers should research what type of instrumentation would best fit the game's overall mood. Find reference material, draft material, scout for composers if there aren't any in-house, etc. When creating adaptive music, sound designers must take into account that if a transition is necessary in the music, then they should make note that the time signature and key signature of the piece is the same, unless, of course, a key change is necessary for more impact in the transition. If a scene in the game should be dramatic and a turning point in the narrative, then the music should reflect that. This should be the case across the whole game in order to maintain cohesion. Every aspect of the game should work together in order to immerse the player and impact their satisfaction in a meaningful way. Adaptive music serves as a way for the player to enter the virtual world, which is why it is such an integral part of a game's experience. There are many different types of ways in which this music can be implemented as explained before. Immersion is the number one factor as to why developers utilize adaptive music in video games, and that can come in the form of motivation in the case of Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, nostalgia in the case of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, and exploration in the case of Journey. Last but not least, I need to shamelessly promote my creative component in collaboration with a friend of mine. For my creative component, I wrote, recorded, produced, mixed, and mastered 13 songs for an original soundtrack for my friend's new show, Let's Go Partner, being released on YouTube early next year. The soundtrack ranges in genres from garage rock, acid jazz, funk, alternative, some elements of hip hop, jazz pop, and I think that covers every genre, I think. Anyways, if you are interested in watching what we made, you will be able to see it on my friend's YouTube channel, Swift Zephyr, when it is released. Also, I know that's not how you pronounce Zephyr, but he insists it being pronounced this way. Don't at me. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who helped with this project, those being Professor Lanier and everyone who took the time to listen to the draft versions of the creative component and provide solid feedback. Without all of you, I don't think the project would have come out nearly as good as it has. I owe it all to you guys, and I appreciate you all so much. Thank you.